Hello and welcome to everyone watching today, wherever you are. Thank you for joining us for this Alumni Hour event. My name is Ange Lavoie-Pierre. I'm a journalist and presenter at the ABC, and this conversation is the second in a series from the University of Melbourne, where we speak with some of the most inspiring alumni from the Faculty of Medicine, Dentistry and Health Sciences. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional owners of the land that I'm on today. I would also like to pay respect to the traditional owners of the many lands that we are all on. I acknowledge that Indigenous Australians have been the custodians of the lands and waterways of Australia for thousands of years. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and I welcome all of our Indigenous guests and future leaders who are present today. Tonight, we have the extraordinary luck to have Melbourne Medical School alum, Associate Professor Luke Burchill, as our guest. Luke is Australia's first Aboriginal cardiologist. He is an accomplished clinician scientist based at the Royal Melbourne Hospital, and he currently leads the Cardiovascular Health Equity Group at the University of Melbourne. He is on a mission, and it is a big one, to achieve health equity in the community, particularly for adults living with congenital heart disease and Victoria's Aboriginal community. Welcome, Luke. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Now, normally I wouldn't start this far back, but I'm starting this far back because it has everything to do with the clinician you are now and your professional goals. So I wanted to start by talking about the place where you grew up.
Yeah, I grew up in Mooroopna, which is about 2.5 hours north of Melbourne, and spent my childhood years in that town and also Echuca, and that's Yorta Yorta country. My mother's a member of the Yorta Yorta Nation and also the Dja Dja Wurrung Nation, which is the Bendigo region. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I went to the local Mooroopna Primary School and then Mooroopna High School, and it was, looking back, it was a childhood that meant that I was very close to country and community and culture.
Yeah, you'll forgive me for aging you somewhat with this question, but this would have been around the 70s, I'm guessing, and 80s, and what kind of place was it back then, would you say?
Yeah, you know, I'm still trying to work that out, to be honest. I met a friend just recently. I bumped into him at my hospital. We were childhood friends and we hadn't seen one another for 40 years and 30 years. And I said to him, I'm trying to work out whether my memory of Mooroopna is the same as yours. And I think Mooroopna at that time was a town, like many country towns, that had problems with racism. Mm. And I think we were literally in the middle of the town. I had an Aboriginal mother and a father who was an English migrant. And although I never really identified as biracial, I realise now that's what I am and that's what I was. And I think in some ways I was positioned right in the middle of those race relations in Mooroopna. And
I suppose being in the Aboriginal community, you would have felt more strongly that you were that and that predominantly, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Which is, you know, I think sometimes was it a bit of a cosmic joke that someone this white could be Aboriginal? And I've shared before that I was known as a Gubborigine.
Okay.
Gubba is a word that we use for white fellas as opposed to black fellas. And yeah, my cousins used to say, oh, you're a real Gubborigine, you are. I mean, my own English father was darker than me.
Yeah, right. Okay.
Which is in context. But yeah, I was on country and I was surrounded by community, and the kinds of stories, the history that was being shared with me was very much about our Aboriginal history, the good and the bad. But it was an interesting life because I would spend many of my summers in the Barmah forest, really on country, learning about particularly Yorta Yorta country, And then alternating summers, I would be up near Geelong at Anglesea with my English family.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I had a foot in both worlds.
Mm. What kind of disparity, I mean, and not that you would have had this language to talk or think about it this way at the time, but looking back on those early years of your life, what kind of disparity did you first begin to witness in terms of health outcomes and access to healthcare?
Yeah, well, I was involved and linked in with the healthcare system for as long as I can remember, because my nan was a paraplegic and she lived with us intermittently throughout the year. So she actually went between each of the sisters in my mother's family. So she would travel between Melbourne, Echuca and Mooroopna. She would stay with us for 3 to 6 months. And when she was with us, it was always regular trips to the hospital. She was a spinal patient linked in with the Austin Hospital here in Melbourne, but often needed to be in regional hospitals, either the Golden Valley Base or Echuca Regional Hospital. And my memories are sort of growing up, running around the hospital, going up and down the lifts with my cousins, spending time with my nan. Disparities, I think at that age, I wasn't thinking about disparities. I was just aware that I had a nan who was diabetic and paraplegic, and we seemed to be going in and out of hospital a lot. Yeah.
Was it during those trips to the hospital that you, I guess, first had the idea to study medicine, or did that come later?
It was my GP. I think it was seeing the impact of my GP, who used to do home visits, and seeing how a GP, someone who's connected to community, can have such a huge impact for an individual, for their family, for their community. That's when I think I started to identify as potentially wanting to be a doctor. But I did explore wanting to be a priest at one point.
Mm.
And my nan, because she grew up on Cumragunja Mission, which was a very Christian mission. She was very proud that her grandson might one day be a priest.
Yeah.
But I grew out of that.
When did it start to feel like a real possibility and not just an abstract idea? And was that, I guess, a hurdle to start to think about it in more concrete terms?
To be a doctor?
Yes, yeah.
Oh, that wasn't until years later. When I came back from overseas, I'd completed year 11, and then in year 12, I really started to think seriously about it. My sister was studying law at the University of Melbourne, and that seemed very interesting to me. But I decided I wanted to do something, go into a field where you get to use your hands as much as your mind, practical sort of things. And that's what drew me to medicine in the end.
Okay. And I want to step back a little bit, because when you were a teenager, you had this trip to South Africa that I wanted to ask about. What was that trip? What did you see when you went over there?
Well, that trip came at a really important time in my life. It came at a time where I didn't really see a future for myself. Sometimes I think I do these interviews because it's cheaper than therapy. I'm in my mid-40s now, and I have a different complexion on that time in my life. And I think what I'm realizing is that year in South Africa, it really took my life on a new path, because I think, like a lot of kids in the country and Aboriginal kids, I'd sort of reached a point where I didn't see a future. and where I didn't believe that others saw a future for me. And South Africa was a year for me to realise that there's a big wide world out there beyond Mooroopna. So that year was the year that Nelson Mandela was released. And as the Gubborigine, the widest Aboriginal kid in my community, to suddenly be in apartheid era South Africa and the dismantling of that apartheid era, staying with a mix of, white and non-white families. It was an exciting time. It was a mind-expanding time, and it really gave me ambition that I didn't have before I left.
Being there at that moment in history, at that pivotal point where such naked structural inequality was being actively dismantled, did it change the way that you saw structural inequality in Australia?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking at that time in my life a lot about colour and race and culture. I started to understand the structural nature of racism, but also I would say more simply, I just realised it was very complex. I speak about structural issues much more now in the work that I do and the research that I lead here at the university. But I don't want to pretend that at age 16, which is how old I was when I was in South Africa, I don't want to pretend I was walking around talking about, post-colonisation and structural racism. I wasn't. Yeah. I remember just thinking, this is very complex. And the community that I ended up spending most of my time with was the so-called coloured community. And at that time, in the coloured community of South Africa, there was this colour gradient that existed even within the community. And there were people who, they became basically pale or white enough to change their designation from being coloured to white. And I remember thinking about what did that really mean, and I didn't really relate to this need to be recognised as white, because that wasn't how I had been raised. I had been raised to truly be proud of being of English heritage, but being proud of being Aboriginal, and one not negating the other. It just is. These are the things that I am. So I think I learnt more on that personal level, seeing people really struggle with race and colour, and seeing that, these stories exist within something like apartheid.
Having come back to Australia, finished school, you then went on to the University of Melbourne to study medicine. How did that feel?
I felt like a complete fish out of water. I realised that I'd got in. It's like sort of high jump, when you plop into the bag and you think, oh, the bar's still up. That's what it was like. Like, that's really what it felt like. And I learnt very quickly in the first year of medicine that my education had not prepared me for medicine. It hadn't taught me how to learn, because the kind of teaching that I had was very much about, if you're naturally gifted and you can get great results in your exams, then you'll do well. But if you're not that, then you're not that. So I'd just been sort of remembering a lot of things and doing well on tests. But of course, when you get to university, you suddenly realise you cannot know everything, and you need to have a strategy for learning.
How quickly did you adjust, or was that quite difficult?
Yeah, it was really difficult.
Yeah.
really, that was another really challenging time. I remember in my first year, I failed a biology exam, and I'm sharing this story because I'm hoping that there are some people out there who are studying and they may have failed an exam. And I just want to say that you can fail an exam and still, go on to have a productive and rewarding career. So I failed this biology exam and I ended up at this learning skills unit. And I had to really take a sort of cold, hard look at myself and this realization, I've never actually been taught how to learn. I was with kids that had gone through the kinds of schools where they had an approach to learning. I mean, I was speaking to my peers saying, how do you know, like, what to take home from that lecture, from this lecture? So I really had to sort of just deconstruct and then reconstruct. And over time, you sort of learn how to learn. But I still feel like I'm learning how to learn.
Why did you come to choose cardiology in particular?
Oh, I chose cardiology. I liked that it was a decisive field of medicine. In cardiology, we fix things quickly. So people come in having a heart attack, we can open a blocked vessel. People come in, their rhythm's not right, we can put them back in a normal rhythm. We have patients that have sort of lifelong conditions, and that's where I've found myself with people that were born with heart defects. We call that congenital heart disease. And even there, I can look after young adults. I can look after pregnant women with heart conditions. It's a really diverse subspecialty, and it includes something that I mentioned earlier. We can all do procedures that help our thinking. They help advance our knowledge, our understanding of what it is that a patient's experiencing. So they're all the reasons I've chosen cardiology. There's a strong evidence base, so there's a lot of evidence also to back up what we're doing each day, and that's also appealing to me.
And after you graduated Melbourne, you took up a postdoctoral fellowship in the US, and you ended up staying on in the US. Tell me, how long did you spend there, and what was that time like?
Yeah, well, I was intending to go overseas for 2 years and stayed for close to 10. So it was a bit of a walkabout, that one. I knew that I wanted to train in adult congenital heart disease, and Toronto has the world's largest and oldest program. And so I went and started a fellowship there, and I realised that I'd found my passion. I agreed to stay on and study heart transplantation as well. So there were an increasing number of these young adults were running into problems with reduced heart function, and they were needing transplants. So I did this unique sort of training that bridged between the congenital heart disease and the heart transplant team. And I subsequently got a job in Portland, Oregon, on the Pacific Northwest. After a little detour to Cleveland Clinic, Ohio, where I did echo for a year, I started working in Oregon as a staff adult congenital heart disease specialist.
I'd be interested to know, having worked in both systems, I mean, this is an enormous question. I don't know if but feel free to take a crack at answering it. How would you how did the two systems compare? I mean, were there frustrations that you felt being witnessing the US health system up close that you could share with us?
Yeah, I mean, there was this moment where I was at Cleveland Clinic, which is arguably the world's leading cardiovascular centre, and it's marble and glass. And more than being marble and glass, they really do provide this exceptional sort of experience for patients, from the patient's perspective. And I remember just standing there thinking, how did I come to be here? I'm from Arupna. I failed that biology exam. How did I get into Cleveland Clinic? I've broken the system. Here I am. And I realised that only a few kilometres from the Cleveland Clinic, there were many people in the community that could not access the Cleveland Clinic. And most of those that we were caring for each day, they were fly-ins. They were fly-in, fly-out patients. And they had 30,000 people flying in from across America for care at Cleveland Clinic. They had, you know, princes from Saudi Arabia flying in for care at Cleveland Clinic. The advantage of training in that centre is you really do get to experience what excellence is. I really believe that is what they provided to their patients. But on the other hand, it was excellence for a select part of our community. And I really, started thinking about what are the social determinants of health here, and why are there these issues around health equity, and what are places like Cleveland Clinic doing to address health equity. So when I took my job in Portland, Oregon, this exploration really continued, and there were heartbreaking moments where people would be on my clinic list to see me as an outpatient, and then their name would suddenly disappear, and I'd be advised, oh, they can't see you because they don't have the correct insurance. So this is the rub. There is excellence there, but it's not available to everyone. And coming back to Australia, what I appreciate is that we are trying our best to provide that safety net and universal healthcare. Now, we have our own issues around access, and I think that we're sort of reckoning with those issues now. Australia is far from perfect, but we have more to work with in providing healthcare that's more democratic and more equitable.
Starting from a better base, perhaps.
I think we're starting from a better base, but if we look at, obviously I'm interested in the Victorian Aboriginal community, we see that there are issues with health access. And there's a worldwide shift to value-based healthcare, which in a nutshell is defining healthcare based upon what we as people need, what patients value. And I think as we shift towards value-based healthcare, it's important for us to be aware of where we're drawing those different values from. So people who are Indigenous have particular values that need to be sort of acknowledged and integrated into the system, just as a migrant community does, or people from non-English speaking background. So they're some of the things that we now need to address if we're going to provide healthcare that's of value and which is equitable.
Yeah, and this is so not on my list of questions, but I want to talk about this with you because it's a question that's been brought into focus by COVID-19, in that all of a sudden everyone had this kind of crash course in health ethics because we had this very acute example of how we distribute care in the form of there's X number of ventilators and X number of people who need them. And the usual kind of matrix that would be applied there would be one associated with, well, who is the youngest and the healthiest already, and therefore will get the greatest use out of the number of years they are allowed then to continue to live. But you're saying that there's a shift in that now, and that there is a redistribution of that value happening because there is a recognition that, well, if, for example, in the Aboriginal community in Australia, people are starting from a worse place in terms of their existing health. So they do have these comorbidities, these other risk factors. Sure, they're there, but that's a consequence of, colonialism and violence that's been done to them that is not of their own doing. Do you think that shift is happening?
I think it's happening. I think that it's trying to happen is what I would say.
Okay.
I work across a lot of organisations as an Indigenous, as an Aboriginal leader. And perhaps to answer your question, I'll just talk about some work that I'm doing with the College of Physicians, and it's with Megan Davis, the architect, co-architect of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. What we've been doing with the College of Physicians is really answering a question that they asked of me as the chair of the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Health Committee. And that was really quite a simple question. It's what's the role of this committee? And we were asking the same question. And when we looked at it, what we realised is that that committee had become an advisory committee. We were rubber stamping a lot of policy and documents that generally came from outside the committee, but for which people were seeking an Indigenous sort of, I would say, perspective or sign-off. It was a very sort of passive role, quite reactive to the issues that came into us, but not one where we were able to really formulate our own priorities or even drive them forward. So the reason I'm working with Megan Davis is that people understand the Uluru Statement from the Heart, or at least they feel they do. And it opens up a conversation about constitutional reform, not just within the country, but for organisations that have signed up, that are signatories to the Uluru Statement. The College of Physicians is one of those. And what I've noticed is in having this dialogue within the College of Physicians, we start with, oh, are you a signatory to the Uluru Statement? You support it? To then moving to what does constitutional reform mean within this organisation? We're not talking about it as a federal government responsibility. We're talking about it as our collective responsibility. And then it leads to discussions around Indigenous governance and Indigenous sovereignty. And this is where I'm coming back to your question. The changes that are required within organisations to really grapple with and respond to those questions of what does Indigenous leadership look like? What does Indigenous governance look like? What does Indigenous sovereignty look like? That's where the work starts happening. And so I think that we are having these conversations, but often in this country, we're having two different conversations. Indigenous people are having one conversation and non-Indigenous people are having a different conversation.
You're hinting at something there, more than hinting really, and it's that the answer to a lot of the problems that you're focused on are to do with being, they need to be driven by community and they need to have Aboriginal voices at the centre. I'm hoping you can, I suppose, educate us on why that is so fundamentally important for change.
Why is it so fundamentally important for change? Well, look at the Rio Tinto, the recent Rio Tinto experience where we've had traditional cultural sites blown up. Would that have happened if we had Indigenous leaders embedded within the organisation? The risk is that it will keep happening if we continue to perform these advisory functions. If we continue to perform the function of rubber stamping ideas that arrive pre-formulated, pre-packaged, often pre-funded, pre-decided. You can go across industries, including Indigenous health research, and unfortunately, this is a well-worn path. And so the position that it leaves Aboriginal and Indigenous people in is that we are responding to things that have already been set in motion, and we're trying to retrofit, retro-engineer, and to put it simply, we're trying to fix things that were not really fit for purpose to begin with from an Indigenous perspective. So Indigenous leadership, we need to be at the table when the ideas are being stated, when they're being formulated. It's not to tick a box. It's not about some sort of idea of parity. It's more than that. It's that we have something to offer. We can bring intelligence and sophistication and excellence to these conversations. And, the idea that there just aren't enough Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to fulfil these roles is no longer true.
I want to come back to that, but in terms of the importance of having a seat at the table in the way that you're talking about, I want to relate that to health in a more focused way. So heart disease in particular, I don't need to tell you that it's the leading cause of death among Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people. They're up to 12 times more likely to die from cardiovascular disease. And you will often hear politicians and policymakers lament the seeming intransigence of health gaps like this one and others. Is that seeming intransigence about that lack of voice, lack of community-driven solutions alone, or is it more than that? I mean, yeah, explain how they relate if you can.
Well, yes. I mean, it is about more than those things. I think that what we're recognising with Indigenous health is that there's been a large percentage of the funding that really went to mainstream organisations rather than Indigenous organisations. So I know that you might pick up the paper on a Sunday and, these articles have been coming out as long as I've been alive, talking about the basket case that is Indigenous health and why can't we fix it. But we haven't yet had an honest conversation as a nation about where the funding has been going. And I think that we have a collective blind spot around this. There's sort of this collective sort of subconscious programming that Indigenous people just can't get their act together, despite receiving heaps and heaps and heaps of money. But when you follow the dollar, most of the dollar has not gone to Aboriginal community-controlled health organisations. Most of the dollar has gone to mainstream organisations administering programs to Aboriginal people. So, some of the questions that you're asking there about, where should we be looking to improve these things? Yes, we should be asking those mainstream organisations, why are they not having an impact when it comes to improving Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health? What I observe in the Aboriginal community-controlled health sector is actually a high level of performance. And I'm doing some research here at the University of Melbourne with my colleague, Associate Professor Luke Burchill, and it's looking at wearable devices for continuous blood glucose monitoring. And this is with the Rumballara Aboriginal Cooperative in my old hometown of Mooroopna. And what we find is that the diabetes outcomes for Rumballara are equivalent, if not better, than mainstream organisations. So why aren't we hearing these stories? Is it because we have become accustomed to a narrative which is Indigenous people as problematic? And that is part of our national narrative. And, it has always been part of our narrative. We need to really challenge that.
You're saying earlier that there's not the excuse anymore of saying that there just aren't enough First Nations people around who are qualified to be putting in these positions of power, being put at the table. You are Australia's first, our first Aboriginal cardiologist, and you are in rarefied territory. Is that changing, and what do we need to do to speed that change up?
Yeah, well, I've said this before. I'm looking forward to the day where I'm not the first Aboriginal cardiologist, and Angela Dos Santos isn't the first Aboriginal neurologist, and Jackie Hughes isn't the first nephrologist. It is changing. We are seeing a network of emerging leaders come together, and we are a really supportive community, and we are going to really help drive the next generation of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander leaders in health research. I'll stay in my lane. That's what I know. It's health research. But I'm working with a number of other leaders around the country, Sandra Eads, Alex Brown, Gail Garvey, and Pat Anderson from Loicha. And we are going to build Australia's first national network of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander researchers. What an amazing opportunity. It's a national network of Indigenous researchers driving Indigenous research. So I think we have a lot to be optimistic about, but we have to look at the full pipeline and think about the kids like me when I was at Maroochna High. How do we realise the full potential of someone who's 14, 15 or 16 and who has the potential but just may not feel that they've been told that they do? We have to start there.
Yeah, I did want to ask about that. What, from your own experience at that age, is there anything there that's, I guess, instructive for people who are looking now and going, okay, how do we make kids realise that they have that in them, that they have that potential at that early stage?
Well, for Aboriginal kids, we need to have an education system that honours Aboriginal history and culture and language, because that is the foundation for our pride. You know, I call it the first gap. So we talk about closing the gap. The first gap we have to close is the two histories of this country. We have people who identify and relate to two histories that are often opposing. So I would say the first thing is for Aboriginal kids and families to feel safe within their schools and safe to proudly relate to their culture. The next step is to identify those with the potential and with the ambition. And that is going to come very much from Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people being able to support Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander kids. So just like we have Aboriginal hospital liaison officers as a linchpin for improving our support of Indigenous patients in our healthcare system, in our hospitals, we need the same in our education system so that these kids can realise their full potential.
What is it that you would like to achieve in this field, in your field? It's a big question I'm going to ask, but over the coming decades, I want to ask long term.
I feel like I'm achieving what I want to achieve. So part of going overseas and being away for almost 10 years, you know, that was time just for me. That was time for me to be a cardiologist. It was a time for me to be recognised on a different playing field internationally, to develop my expertise as an adult congenital and heart failure expert. And, you know, what I found is not having to think about communicating things in a way that is palatable because it's around the complexities of Indigenous stuff. You know, it was, in some ways it was liberating. It was easy. It was easier. I could just be a cardiologist that did adult congenital heart disease and heart failure. You know, they're hard enough.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
And now coming back to Australia, what I often feel sort of overwhelmed by the sort of sheer workload, but also very excited because I'm back on country, I'm back with community, and I'm able to enter some of those spaces that Indigenous people haven't entered before, and have some of the conversations like you and I are having today around what Indigenous leadership is and what it is that we bring, and what value we can provide to organisations that are interested in improving equity.
Some of your recent work, Luke, has also strayed into the field of mental health, which at first blush is, you know, not a natural course, I suppose, for a cardiologist. What brought you there?
Well, I've really got sort of two answers to this. The first is I work with young adults with congenital heart disease, and they have a high rate of anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder. And I've learned over the years that the only way that you can care for people's hearts is if you care for people's minds. So we have to really gain trust, and to be effective, we have to listen to our patients and, you know, the gamut of their experiences, not just what's happening with their chest pain or their heart rhythm. But the second reason I feel that I've come to this space, this mental health space, it does relate to growing up Aboriginal. You know, growing up Aboriginal is, it's a really rich life. It's something that provides me with my grounding and a lot of pride. I am part of this huge community, and together we share our culture and our history, and we also share our resilience. And I have come to this project now that focuses on mental health because of the question of trauma. COVID-19 is, you know, truly unprecedented, and it's exposing health workers to potentially traumatic events on a daily basis. But growing up, I had family members that had experienced really significant trauma, and that trauma has a ripple effect that travels across generations, and I have felt that myself. There are things that we can do to really limit that ripple effect. So that's why I've ended up in this space. It's a heart specialist that deals with young adults with mental health issues, but an Aboriginal man that grew up in a family that was deeply impacted by intergenerational trauma.
It's interesting to hear you say, you know, you can't treat the heart without sort of treating the mind as well. I'm sure that there are plenty of other disciplines in medicine for which the same rule would apply. Is it perhaps something that should be prioritised more highly in the training that is given to doctors, and that's a sort of a kind of interdisciplinary focus that's just as a must?
Absolutely. I mean, isn't it crazy? Isn't it crazy that one would think that because you've become a heart specialist that it's not your responsibility to be interested in your patient's mental health? I mean, people don't exist as single conditions. And people want to relate. That's part of being human. But it follows they want to relate to their clinicians. But our training, it prepares us to sort of fragment ourselves from the community. So yes, I'm all for training programs that teach us these skills. But COVID is a different thing again. And this is coping strategies, mental preparation strategies for frontline workers who suddenly faced an influx of people with COVID and who were caring for people that were dying, mainly elderly people dying alone with COVID. Those stories are really heartbreaking. These are stories of final farewells. These are stories of iPad delivered goodbyes. These are stories of nurses going home and not letting their kids touch them because they're worried that they've got COVID. Hospital workers living in their family's garage because they're so scared that they're going to infect their families. During the first wave of COVID, you know, I was hearing these stories and I realised I am not mentally prepared for this. And so that's why I brought together a team of researchers, digital mental health specialists, Phoenix, which is the National Centre for Post-Traumatic Stress, and we started to develop solutions to support these health workers and to help keep them mentally prepared and mentally effective and safe and healthy while working on the front line.
Have you had some positive results? I mean, has it been effective? Do you feel as if there are strategies that are equal to this task, because it is an extraordinary task and, you know, obviously you're still going through it?
Well, our go live is September the 25th, but there's a very strong research component to the study. We've interviewed 30 health workers. We've held a workshop to further understand the themes that emerged from those interviews. And we also mapped the mental health care pathways. And what we found is more than 30 different mental health care pathways, but none of them really were specific to hospital workers and not specific to these events, these major events such as COVID-19. So when we mapped the mental health pathways, it was like looking at the London Underground map. And we looked at the literature, and the literature tells us that health workers are much less likely to seek help, even though they're suffering from things like anxiety, depression, substance abuse, acute stress, post-traumatic stress disorder because of previous events. And what the app will do is make it easier for people to access the care that they need to access. It's yet to be seen whether it will achieve those things, but what we can say confidently at this point is health workers, hospital workers have really been part of the missing middle when it comes to mental health support. And that dates back before COVID. So things need to change.
What advice do you have for med students who might be approaching the end of their studies now and are about to be going into these jobs at an incredibly uncertain time, it has to be said?
Yeah, you know, it's a big step. It's a big step without COVID. So the first piece of advice I would have is the importance of asking that question, are you okay? And I think part of that is asking oneself, am I okay? And I shared earlier in the interview, you know, it's only upon reflection that I realised that my year in South Africa was a lifesaver for me. I can now look back and realise that I was not okay. And we put up lots of barriers. I call it a rind. It's like the rind on the orange peel. It can grow really thick, but there will be a point at which you have to reckon with the fruit that is underneath the rind. So yeah, thinking about these med students, ask if you're okay, and it's okay to speak to someone, and that might be someone that you really trust as a friend, but it also could be someone who you trust as a mentor, or it might need to be your GP. And there are mental health services available, particularly for younger people. And I'm linked in through my research now with Origin and Headspace, Black Dog Institute, Beyond Blue, and Are You OK? They all offer some self-directed access to supports, more than what existed when I was much younger. But on the bright side, there is a great future ahead in this career. I am so glad that I chose to study medicine. I'm so glad that when I failed my biology sub, I went back and sat it again and rose to the challenge. And that I've gone on all the journeys that I've gone on. I've been overseas. I've been to, you know, the world's best cardiovascular center. I'm back now leading research that fuels my passion. It's about helping my community. These are all things that a career in medicine can and will provide for you. And that's just my story. You know, there's thousands more.
Luke Burchill, thank you so much for your generosity in speaking with us today. It's very much appreciated.
Thank you. Thanks for your time.
what can future clinicians do to help ensure equitable access to health services for Indigenous Australians, Luke?
Yeah, I just watching that interview again, I think I've been careful not to portray myself as a know-it-all. I would certainly not be allowed in my family or community. So I'm not here to tell people, what all the solutions are. And I think it's very difficult for individuals to change entire systems. But I take the question, and I think that I still come back to the Uluru Statement and its intent. So I think it's important to read the Uluru Statement and the process by which voice, treaty and truth were arrived at, and to really contemplate how does that translate to the lives that we live today. I think it's really interesting as I review that process, what community really delivered. So remember that the Uluru Statement was a gift to the Australian community. It wasn't to government, it was to us. And that emphasis on voice for me, it means that we need to hear and listen to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So I think I'm going to keep it simple. I think that if you want to make a difference, then please listen to the voices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It's hard to reconcile, it's hard to change, it's hard to address the inequities if people do not know or understand the community that they're trying to assist. 30% of Australians, only 30% of Australians have relationships, what they would regard as a relationship with an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person. So we need to just start by listening and understanding one another's experiences.
We've got one that's come through today, which I think is a really beautiful question. So in regards to the misdirection of funding for Close the Gap initiatives, which we spoke about in the interview, do you think this desire to fix the gap from the outside comes from a traditional view of medicine that seeks to fix problems rather than address needs? And how do you see this view of healthcare being shifted or challenged at the Royal Melbourne?
Look, I think that the Royal Melbourne has had quite a journey when it comes to reconciliation. We've just, in this last week, we've sent around our Reconciliation Action Plan. And I'm actually really proud of the work that the Aboriginal Working Group has done at Royal Melbourne Hospital. Part of the process has been to recognise that we have a long way to go. Just in terms of even defining the community, the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander community that we serve. But I would say that we have risen to the challenge. I would not suggest that Royal Melbourne Hospital is currently, embraced traditional approaches to healthcare. I think that's something that we can look forward to in the future. The fixing from the outside, I just think that a lot of Australians have a sense of urgency that they want to do something. So I'm not critical of that. And it's something that I experience quite regularly. I mentioned the work that I'm doing with the College of Physicians and the changing conversations around Indigenous leadership. There is this urgency. Let's support Indigenous leaders. But often there hasn't been much consideration for what happens once the Indigenous leaders are placed in positions where they can help to identify priorities and drive change. The reason things fall down is because we still have this, cognitive problem where we regard Indigenous stuff as a nice to have, as an extra piece of work, rather than core business. We really need to address, if we're interested in advancing the health of Australians, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are Australians, it's core business. So we don't need a separate committee and we don't need a separate meeting to discuss, how we're going to resource this. It should just be embedded and ingrained throughout organisations and throughout our culture.
You mentioned in there that you look forward to the day where traditional medicine is incorporated into into mainstream approaches. We actually had a question along these lines anyway. So, you know, beautiful work there. I guess, how can you give us a bit of a sketch of what that might look like and what the path there might look like?
How does traditional medicine become incorporated? How do we privilege?
Yes.
Well, I'll talk about it from an Indigenous perspective, because I know that there's lots of traditions and traditional medicine approaches. If we are to privilege Indigenous knowledge and practices and within a healthcare setting, we need to create the space for those, for that knowledge and for that wisdom to be expressed. This is happening. So Inala, the Inala Health Service in Queensland, that's run by my colleague and friend Noel Heyman, that's a great example of Indigenous-led healthcare. But just take note, it's not healthcare that needs to be siloed or quarantined from mainstream practices. It's healthcare that integrates the two. You know, I'm very interested in the work of the Ngangkari in Central Australia and South Australia, and what I see is that they're clearly attending to a need among Indigenous people for our cultural well-being to be acknowledged, responded to, supported and strengthened. If we could get this right for Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people, I think we can get it right for all Australians. Actually, what I see in the hospital every day is that non-Indigenous Australians are also crying out for healthcare that meets them where they are. Mm. And that includes things such as on a cultural and a spiritual level.
I don't know how much exposure you've had to the New Zealand system, but I've got a question here that came in a little ahead of time, and it says that Maori culture is embedded in every aspect of healthcare and society in New Zealand. You know, from what I've seen, that is the case. Is it possible to aim for the same for Australia?
Well, the short answer is yes.
Yeah.
I think that we can, but I just have to question: is Maori culture embedded in all aspects of healthcare and society in New Zealand? The fact is, unfortunately, that our Maori cousins face the same health inequities that we do. They have less employment, they have less safe housing, they have a short lifespan compared to non-Maori people. You know, they have more sickness through their lives. And when I speak to my Maori colleagues who I work with as part of my work on the College of Physicians, there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of recognising that we as Indigenous people have borne the brunt of colonisation, and that is the basis of our inequities.
There's a question here, learning to learn, and that really hit a raw nerve with someone who was watching today because they're in the middle of a career transit. So a lot of people are struggling to cope with the drastically changed circumstances and need to relearn to negotiate the new realities. Would Dr. Luke like to throw some more light on his learning to learn mindset in the current scenario?
I think that really sort of comes from a place of modesty. I try to be modest. So I was trying to express that. I try to be humble. So if we start from the point of humility, then I think we're always learning to learn. This question could be taken in a few different ways. If it's particularly in relation to sort of Indigenous health and reconciliation, that is absolutely about all of us accepting that we are going to be learning from now to the end. That's what reconciliation is. But for me, the reconciliation journey, it has always been one that starts with me. And I would encourage anyone who wants to continue learning to learn to do the work, and do the work that starts with ourselves. And sometimes we need support to do that, particularly during COVID-19. Sometimes we need people to guide us on that journey so that we can deal with that thick rind I was talking about in the interview and get down to the rich fruit. But it can be very confronting, and I would recommend some support if that's the journey that you're feeling ready for.
I've got a question here that's a little general. There's perhaps a couple of ways that we could take it. The question is, what are the main issues with Indigenous Australians not receiving care for congenital heart issues? I suppose you could take that to mean the issues that flow from that or the issues that contribute to it. I'll let you answer it how you'd like to.
Yeah, what's really interesting about congenital heart disease for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is we just don't know. We just don't know. So we don't have any good national statistics on the prevalence of congenital heart disease. We have reports that come from different states that indicate that there's a much higher level of congenital heart disease in certain communities. The reasons for this are not clear. When working in a large tertiary clinic, as I do at Royal Melbourne, which is one of Australia's largest adult congenital heart programs, we see a really small number, a handful of people who are Indigenous coming for care. And when I speak to my colleagues around the country, they report the same. So I think that this opens up a broader discussion around how we identify and welcome Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people into our spaces and into our healthcare system. Because the evidence suggests that there is a higher prevalence, but we're not seeing it in the clinics. So I think part of the work that we need to do is, what is the messaging around congenital heart disease? And again, does that messaging understand, communicate, value, prioritise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander experiences?
It seems like that messaging and the way that people feel welcome in those spaces is that's an area that you've identified. And I asked you in the interview what your kind of very long-term goals were. I want to ask you now what your very near ones are. What is your kind of priority in the work that you do in addressing this inequity in the Victorian Aboriginal community? What are your kind of priorities for 2020 and 2021?
Well, we've just finished some work where we're linking data between general practices and hospitals. And this is quite unique in that we're able to follow individuals as they travel across the healthcare system. So we call it that primary tertiary care continuum. And so one of my short-term goals is to understand those healthcare journeys of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, mainly Victorian Aboriginal people, for this research. But what's really interesting is we've started with the very first question of who is Indigenous, who is Aboriginal in this data set. And what the research shows us is that we have a very small number of people who are being identified. We see quite a significant difference depending upon whether people are identified in a primary care versus an emergency versus a ward setting. And this has really significant implications for how we understand things like how common a disease is, whether interventions are working or not. So I think about it as terra nullius revisited. I think that we are invisible in these data sets, and our indigeneity in the current healthcare system is not recognised because our system was not built to recognise it. So that's my short-term goal. It's to understand and communicate the findings of this research, because I think it has implications not just for the Victorian Aboriginal community, but for communities around the country.
How hopeful do you feel in the face of the challenges that you've set yourself against?
Well, you know, I've come from a family of battlers. We're a resilient mob. Us Yorta Yorta Jar Jar Wurrung people. We're still here. These are, you know, in some ways, this is nothing. This is nothing compared to what my community have survived.
That's a beautiful answer to leave it on. I could ask you many more questions, Luke, but we'll leave it there. So thank you, Luke Burchill, for speaking with us, for your generosity and for your insight.
Thanks, Angela. Thanks for the time. It's been a pleasure.
The next event in the Alumni Hour series is on the 13th of November. Our guest then will be Associate Professor Tom Oxley. As well as being a Melbourne University graduate, he is a vascular and interventional neurologist and a world expert in endovascular bionics. I will be looking that up. He has an incredible story to tell. So thank you for joining us tonight, and we will see you next time.